Okay, welcome everybody to the Institute for Ideas and Imagination. I'm Mark Mazar, the director. I'd like to begin by thanking Susan Boynton, the resident faculty director, and the staff who've made these Mercredis à l'Institut such a success through the year. We are going to have a speaker, one of our own, Karen van Dyck, and a respondent, Dimitris Christopoulos, who I'm going to introduce in a moment. And then there will be questions, which I've been told to tell you may be in French, Greek, or English. And then there's food upstairs on the third floor, if you can stay, which we hope you can. But I'm actually very glad to have the opportunity to present this particular speaker for a very special reason, which is that the first time that I learnt modern Greek was when I went on a summer school in Thessaloniki in the summer of 1980. And they housed us at what I now realize was basically a brothel, the Hotel Capsis, which was on the road in from the station to town. And for some reason, this is where they put all the students who were coming to the summer school. And I actually remember getting into the elevator one day, and there in the middle of the people in the elevator was this extremely attractive young American undergraduate. And it turned out that her name was Karen van Dyck. And we've been friends ever since. And so it's very special for me to be able to introduce Karen to you, above all here in Paris at the Institute, as I'm sure you can imagine. Karen, well, I won't go that far back. Karen has been teaching at Columbia since 1988. I think, not earlier than that, no. Founded the program in Hellenic Studies and was director of the program for nearly 20 years. And so effectively, insofar as there is modern Greek at Columbia, it's really owing to Karen. And she's the Kimone Doukas Professor of Modern Greek Language and Literature in the Classics Department. She's written or edited or co-edited or translated no fewer than 9 books. And she is known as one of the leading translators of modern Greek literature, poetry and prose in the world. And some of you may have had the chance to read the really fantastic bilingual. How did you persuade Penguin to produce a bilingual anthology of poetry in this day and age? It's an almost incredible thing. Bilingual anthology of contemporary Greek poetry called Austerity Measures that came out with Penguin and the New York Review of Books imprint in 2016 and won the London Hellenic Book Prize of that year. And then another book that I have to mention that came out in the same time, very different, was Histories of Every Day. It was a collection of stories of daily life on the island of Egina during the German occupation that she co-edited with a friend of ours, FIDH. So these are 2 of her many books. And Karen is going to speak to us about migration, translingualism, and translation. And we have a respondent who is also an old friend of mine, Dimitris Christopoulos, who's president of the Fédération Internationale des Ligues des Droits de l'Homme, probably the oldest and certainly the most prestigious international human rights organization in the world. There are even scholarly studies of the interwar incarnation of the Ligue des Droits de l'Homme that I've read. His interest in human rights, I think it's fair to say, started with an interest in minority rights that I suspect was connected with being a student in Thrace and Komotini, which is one of the centers of the Muslim minority in Greece. And he then trained mostly in France in law, and he's currently a professor of political science where he teaches about minority rights law at Pantheon University in Athens. And he is the author of a number of important books, but he's also well known in Greece and here as one of the most important activists in Europe in the realm of minority rights and human rights in general, which of course, given the crisis in Greece, the refugee crisis in Greece right now, has propelled him into the public eye. So we're very fortunate and glad, Dimitris, that you could come and talk. So that's enough from me. It's a great pleasure that I welcome Karen van Dyck to the podium.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Marie, Eve, Grant. It's been an incredible and is an incredible privilege to be a part of this wonderful new endeavor that we're all doing, bringing together artists and academics. So thank you. Increasingly, literature asks how to translate the foreign accents and multilingual idioms of the migrant. Two contemporary Greek narratives, one about Greeks in America and the other about Greek Albanians in Greece, create translingual spaces that are themselves translational. And by this I mean about and informed by the act of translation. In the novella about Greeks in America, the hero, Andreas Korthopatis, arrives in New Orleans in 1907, knowing no English. Κουβέντα δεν ήξερα, έτσι πηγαίνοντας βλέπω μια φρουταρία. Έκαιγε φως. Με είδε ο άνθρωπος από μέσα. Ιταλιάνο μου λέει. No, Γκρέκο του λέω. Buono Γκρέκο. Ιταλιάνο τον ρωτάω. Yes, μου λέει. Buono Ιταλιάνο του λέω και εγώ. Τον ρωτάω, ύστερε γκριξάλα, δωμάτιο ύπνου, έκλαιγαν τα μάτια μου. Δεν μπορούσαμε να συνεννοηθούμε. So I'm translating the passage here just for sort of our purposes right now, and sort of to be as close to the structural similarities. And I'm trying to underscore these phrases that are translingual, right? So no Greco, anything that's sort of between languages. Migration proliferates translingualism. And by this I mean the movement between and juxtaposition or synthesis of two or more languages. As migrants daily manage different languages, they often resort to the use of loanwords and code switching, transliteration and homophonic repetition, pidgins and creoles, as well as other hybrid forms that depart from standard usage. Not only do migrants routinely engage in translating between languages, but their language use develops a translingual poetics that is rooted in translation. To move from one alphabet or writing system to another, to bring the sounds of one language into another, to calque, to paraphrase, annotate, all mainstays of diasporic literature are also tried and true tactics of translators. Just as translations traditionally involve changing a source into a translated text, translingual literature abounds with examples of similar crossings. So, code switching, right? Such as, I'm just going to kind of give you a list of some of the things that, so we all are on the same page, because all of us are using different examples in our heads right now to think about what translingualism is. Code switching, just as the juxtaposition, such as the juxtaposition of a loanword to a definition, so that it means something to a monolingual reader, is the most obvious case. The expression in the passage I just read you, Greek sala, in the context of the phrase Greek sala δωμάτιο ύπνου, makes it clear to the Greek reader, knowing no Italian or English, that Korthopatis wants a place to stay. Translingual literature begins to redefine the more conventional notion of translation when spelling encompasses two or more languages in the same word or phrase. For example, frutaria, in which the visibly recognizable Greek word fruta is embedded in the Italian loanword for fruit store. Transliteration, writing the sounds of one alphabet in another, and homophony, sharing sounds within and across writing systems and languages, collapse the source and translated texts into one another, fusing them in surprising ways that are once radically translational and particularly demanding and challenging for the translator, right? So they are translational, but they are very difficult to translate. Two immigrant narratives, or itineraries, right, and their representation in contemporary Greek fiction provide a useful comparative site for a discussion of translingualism and literary translation. Thanasis Valtinos' 1972 novella, The Book of Andreas Korthopatis, Part 1, America, follows Korthopatis from his hometown in the Peloponnese to the United States during the first decade of the 20th century. Sotiris Dimitrios' 1993 novel, May Your Name Be Blessed, addresses the more recent migration of a boy with mixed heritage born in Albania to Greek parents who returns to Greece after the Albanian communist regime ends in 1991. Although these novels represent different periods of migration, their forms of linguistic hybridity have striking resemblances. In both, creoles, such as Gringlish and Albanian, create shared spaces between languages that resonate for two or more communities. Any clear separation of source and target languages is challenged, since within the texts, translation begins and ends in a place that is between languages and cultures. An examination of English translations of these Greek texts offers an opportunity to consider the problems that their movement into a major language creates, revealing the difficulty of keeping minor literature minor, so that through translation it can interrogate the status quo in the major culture. Might translingualism, rather than being impossible to translate, be a resource for rethinking the relations between translation, migration, and world literature, and a catalyst for developing inventive translation practices? Okay, that's the kind of big claim. We're going to look at the specific cases here. Two works of fiction by Valtinos and Dimitris offer different but interrelated answers to the question of how narratives of migration represent translingual practices that are themselves translational. In the first, the representation of Gringlish relies more on transliteration to point up issues of illiteracy and untranslatability. In the second, the representation of Albanian relies more on homophony to enable communication and translation. If, in Valtinos' novella, transliteration proves to be an obstacle to the concept of translation as assimilation, in Dimitris' novel, homophony allows for a concept of translation as cross-cultural cohabitation. Transliteration gives prominence to the practice of writing and the look of the alphabet. So I think we all know what this is, but I'll just rehearse how it works in linguistic terms, right? It's the substitution of a letter or sign from one alphabet for a letter or sign in another alphabet, right? Such as the Latin S for the Greek sigma. It connects two languages through similar sound and visual patterns so that a word or phrase can be said, written down, but I think this is the important part. With transliteration, it doesn't have to be understood, right? These are words that we just can say, we can read, but we don't have to know what they mean. So, souvlaki, right? Or, as we'll see in the Cordopatis, these are the names of cities, right? Sanlaiki city. Like translation, transliteration is a translingual process, but whereas translation generally involves finding a different word in the receiving language that corresponds in form and meaning to the word in the source language, transliteration stops at replicating the sound of the word in the new alphabet. It represents the confrontation of orality with literacy. When a transliterated word first appears in text, it's not likely to mean anything except to those readers who know both languages or dialects. Over time, however, transliterated words can become meaningful for certain ethnic groups, and even more generally for monolingual speakers of the transliterating language. Most notably, right, for food. We know what souvlaki is, we know what teriyaki is, we know what kimchi is, right? As immigrants are accepted and assimilated, transliterated words are replaced by a more systematic idiom, culinary jargon, or creole. Yet what distinguishes transliteration is its initial lack of a signified in the receiving culture. Okay, so I'm going to hold on to that. It's not that over time, transliterated words then become creoles, gringlishes, or spanglishes, right? And then they become something that a community can speak and understand. But the first moment is something in which it is just something that we can move from one language to another without meaning. Okay? Yeah? Okay. In the book of Andreas Cordopatis, Part 1, transliteration is a central practice by which Cordopatis, the Greek migrant who narrates his story in Greek, tries to make sense of the host country, the United States. Through the alphabetic approximation of sound, English names of railway cities and towns like Salt Lake City are Grecized, right? We have Sanlaiki City, Pocatelli, Idaho. I mean, and the whole book is just full of these Gringlish words. The same practice occurs with words for things that seem to have no equivalent for the bewildered newcomer seeking work. So we get words like fripes, time check, 4 blocks, my favorite, go home. Transliteration creates a translingual vocabulary that reflects the general problem facing Cordopatis, his own misunderstanding, as well as being misunderstood by the people that he encounters. When Kordopattis finally gets to America, he's told he can't stay because of trachoma, the eye infection that has really plagued him from the start. He's already been sent back by the Italian doctors in Naples when he was diagnosed, and now at this moment when the American doctor is examining him, Gringlish inserts itself into Greek and with a little help of Italian recapitulates the whole inconclusive journey. Translingualism through the labor of transliteration captures the difficulty of getting through customs. Ήρθε ο γιατρός και άρχισε να εξετάζει έναν. Όποιος ήταν καλός του έδινε μια κάρτα με μπλε μολύβι και έγραφε πάνω «Alright», αμερικάνικα. Όποιος δεν ήταν καλός του έδινε σκάρτ με κόκκινο. Okay, again, I'm underlining the translingual words here. Transliteration not only figures in Kordopattis' inability to get through customs, it also demonstrates the inability of orality to pass seamlessly into literacy. The Gringlish word "alright" and "skart" belong to the process of entering the United States. Success involved a word written in the English alphabet, all right. Failure, simply a dash. In 19th century English, the word skart meant a scratch or an ink mark. But for immigrants who were coming to America, it had a very special meaning, and it was that kind of the feared red pencil on your entry card, right? That meant that you weren't going to get in. You know, you had trachoma, you had some health problem, you were rejected. For the Greek reader, given Kordopattis' previous stopover in Italy, the word skart has already accrued multilingual references that reinforce this necessity of deportation for the sick and the illiterate. The Greek word skartos is a loan word from the Italian scarto, meaning reject, and the fact that the English skart, the sign of exclusion, partially rhymes with carta, another Italian loan word signifying the immigrant's entry card or ticket to freedom, kind of has this way of, ominously foreshadowing the unsuccessful conclusion to the story. The S privative that creates negatives in Italian, scarta for discard, not carta for card, repeats the immigrant story of being turned back in Naples all over again. Transliterated translingual words perform the difficult, inadequate translation from English and Italian to Greek while posing the problem of untranslatability. So we have clear eyes with trachoma, right? Legibility and literacy are all right, and infected eyes, illegibility, and illiteracy are not. And of course, this is happening in the text. We're feeling it. Do we understand all these things? No, but there's something going on. We know that something's happening by moving between Greek, Italian, English in this particular way. It's telling things to us, right? It's kind of performing the problems. Over the course of the novel, transliteration continues to challenge the American pressure to assimilate. Here is the passage which I began with the Italian underlined and the Gringlish in blue. The fruit seller's question, Italiano, translates the Italian, Italiano, are you Italian? And also the Greek immigrant's answer, no, Greco, no, I'm Greek. While the word yes, right, the English. But in the same way, a transliterated word doesn't have a clear meaning in the receiving culture, so the Italian and English remain disconnected and translation impossible. I think it's telling that no is the only word actually in this whole text that you can read in both alphabets, the same, right, the word no. Although transliteration underscores the separateness of the two worlds, it also facilitates the possibility of an alternative future. Whereas Greek-English dictionaries and jail cells with combination locks in the English alphabet are impenetrable, transliteration gradually creates an in-between vocabulary. So over the course of this book, we begin to learn words, right? We learn alright, skart, fripas, that makes Creole and the back and forth journey a viable way of life. In the penultimate scene of the novel, Kordopattis awaits deportation at Castrigari, the Gringlish name for Castle Garden, the original New York entry port, and then also by extension, Ellis Island. For Greeks and other migrants to the United States, what at first sounded like nonsense, Castle Garden, Castrigari, has become meaningful through repetition, a context, and a community. The translingualism in Sotiris Dimitrios' novel, May Your Name Be Blessed, enacts a different yet related form of translation, one even more focused on sound. A literal translation of the title would in fact be that I may better hear your name. Right? It's may your name be blessed, may I hear that your name is praised, naku kala to onomasio, but it actually literally has that sense of listening. If in Valtinos's tale, transliteration introduced the possibility of a creole that didn't yet exist, in Dimitrios, homophony relies on translingual idioms that have been centuries in the making. Here, the translational hinges on hybridity as a given of linguistic communication rather than as the communicative failure of monolingualism. Transliteration involves homophony to the extent that it carries over the sounds from one alphabet to another, but homophony is a much more broad and encompassing category. It exists interlingually between languages with the same or different alphabets, as well as between dialects and idioms that are purely oral, and it exists intralingually within the same language. Like rhyme and alliteration, homophony emphasizes orality over literacy by signifying meaning through sound. In the popular documentary, 2003 documentary, Whose Is This Song?, a Bulgarian, a Greek, a Turk, a Macedonian, and a Serb all claim the same song as their own. In these regions, the same spaces are often used by Muslims and Christians alike. Similarly, words and expressions common to two or more languages emphasize the cross-ethnic and religious porousness of the Balkans. So I'm trying to say that we understand that people use the same spaces to do different kinds of religious ceremonies, but sometimes we don't think of language and sounds as being kind of spaces like that. So I'm trying to say that these words are being spoken by different people, but they're the same sounds. On opposite sides of barbed wire fences, the word gremines, kazania sound the same and refer to the same thing: impassable, craggy mountain ravines and cooking pots. The transliteration we encountered in the Valtinos novella and this homophonic continuum between languages are distinguished not only by a cognitive dimension, whether literacy or orality is privileged, but also by a temporal dimension, when the language use becomes meaningful. With transliteration, sounds in one language often don't yet have a meaning in the transliterating language, and translation is postponed or blocked. Whereas with homophony, the same sounds mean something in different languages and dialects simultaneously, and translation has already happened, even if it is often unacknowledged. Dimitrios' characters inhabit a world of unclear borders left over from the Ottoman Empire until they confront a new created one between Greece and Albania in 1913. The narrative relates the separation of two sisters, Alexo and Sofia, because of this national division. Only after Enver Hoxha's communist regime falls, decades later, can Sofia's grandson leave Albania and retrace her steps back to Greece. Dimitrios' language, however, tells a very different story, one of constant connection and linguistic blending. Okay, so the story is saying one thing, and then what the language is doing is quite a different thing. Although this novel is published by a mainstream Greek publisher, the language is full of the dialect that Greeks call Voria Iperotica and Albanians Chamtosk. To describe Dimitrios' writing as Northern Iperot, as is usually the case, however, I think is misleading. The translational force of the translingualism depends not on subordinating dialects to one national language, but on understanding them as homophonic passageways between languages. A common Balkan vocabulary, what I'm calling Albanian, exists for geography, agriculture, and things close to the home of everyday sociability. In both Greek and Albanian, konak means home, kunata, sister-in-law, morak, worry, kuvet, mukhabet, talk and gossip. Arabic and Turkish terms for authorities and land divisions, familiar to Greeks, Albanians, and Bulgarians, show up repeatedly. Mukhtaris for mayor, mahalas for settlement or neighborhood. Performative language like aide for calling someone, or aman for asai, is another site of homophony between languages. Repeatedly, the pain of exile and separation is ameliorated by sounds that cross ethnic divisions. Working in the fields in Albania, Sofia and her aunt hear a bell from a church in Greece and are reminded how, like the sound, they too used to go back and forth freely. Later, forced to live in an Albanian household, Sofia explains how she and her husband feel like familia, meses exeni familia. She soon finds herself, however, communicating with ease in a mix of idioms that are both hers and theirs. Ke kuvendiasaman, opos kuvendiasaman, nya gelasman dama. The phrase The phrases exemplify two kinds of homophony. One, intralingual, insofar as each of them involves a certain kind of repetition, right, of the word, and the other interlingual, insofar as both signify in Greek and Albanian alike. Gralbanian, like songs and bells, recalls what is most common even at moments of great tension. Proper names, a particularly contested area for migrants, also function homophonically in the novel. In both intralingual and interlingual terms, the importance of homophony as a translational strategy is clinched, for example, when we finally learn the name of Sophia's grandson. So the whole last section has gone on, and we don't know what the name is of the narrator, who has returned to Greece seeking work. Finding life in Athens tough, he contemplates going back to Albania and hitches a ride to the bus station with a kid named Dimitris, whom he thanks and he wishes well, using the title from the phrase from the title. Na kukala to onomashu, Dimitri. May I hear your name blessed, Dimitri. The addition of the kid's name is important. It connects the author's name, right? It connects Dimitris to Dimitriou, which is the author's name. For readers prepared by this Greek name as a site of intralingual homophony, and again, this is sonic sense. It's not something that we're like thinking out, okay? But we get this kind of sense of Dimitris, Dimitriou on the cover. The much anticipated revelation of the narrator's name in all its interlingual homophony is even more jarring. Daydreaming about returning to Albania, the narrator hears his sister calling out to their mother, "Oh, mana, erthe, spetim." The boy's name, Spetim, is a Greek version of Spetim, the Albanian sh sound being impossible to pronounce in Greek, or write for that matter. Although the main characters of this whole novel they really are, they identify as Greeks, right? This quintessential, what I'm calling a Gralbanian name, is what ultimately defines the migrant subjectivity in this novel. The invocation of the title turns out to be as much about literally listening well to the name, a homophonic kind of listening, as it is about wishing the other do well. In fact, listening homophonically is what enables people such as Dimitris and Spetim to succeed. To hear Dimitriou in Dimitris or Spetim in Spetim is to understand something important about migrant survival. Often it involves sharing things even when the sharing is not conscious. The doubling of names with the intermixing of languages is even more meaningful if we consider the author's full name, Sotiris Dimitriou, and the fact that in Albanian and Greek the names Spetim and Sotiris both contain the root word savior. Relating intralingual and interlingual homophony in words and phrases underscores the translational density of translingualism and acknowledges translation as a partial process in which the passage and residue between languages matter more than the final destination. Like Valtinos's tale, Dimitriou's ends with the migrant trying to figure out what to do next. But whereas in the American case, Korthopatis is still determined to be either here or there, in the Balkan case, Spetim can be both. Δεν ήξερε τι να κάνω, ήμουν στα δύο. Να πήγαινε σήμερα στον μάστορα, μην χάσω το μερόκαμα. Για παραπέρα δεν ήξερα. Listening homophonically reveals that uncertainty is not necessarily bad. The Greek word parapera, meaning after that, sounds like the Albanian perpara, meaning further on, as well as perparim, the Turkish word for success. Only by risking what he didn't know can the migrant move on and do well for himself. The act of piling up languages as a sonic and semantic palimpsest reinforces the uncertainty of where he will end up, but also allows the story to make a place for translation as unexpected collaboration. I think we're going to come back to this later when Dimitris' response. We were talking about the importance of this kind of ability of moving between languages as a kind of cultural capital. Okay, so now what happens when you try to translate this, right? Translating translingualism is a complicated endeavor, both practically and ethically. To translate from Greek into English involves moving from a minor to a major language. To translate Gringlish, Gritalian, or Gralbanian from Greek into English involves a double or triple maneuver, moving from a minor idiom or dialect in a minor language to a major language, or to a minor idiom or dialect in a major language, devising different solutions for hybridity and cultural prestige. How translators deal with the power imbalance among different languages and dialects is in large part what determines what counts as world literature. Jane Asimacopoulos' version of the Book of Andreas Kordopattis, Part 1 America, and Leo Martian's version of May Your Name Be Blessed respond very differently to the multiple languages in the Greek text, but both show the resistance of translation to the lessons of translingualism, especially as a political project. Asimacopoulos plays down the difficulty of decoding foreign words and phrases by defining or explaining them, while Marshall cultivates linguistic eccentricities without developing a narrative logic for their disorienting effect. Both minimize the significance of the in-between migrant world inhabited by these stories. By paying attention to the blind spots in these existing translations, in particular to how they both erase translingualism, I want to develop new ways of thinking not only about the problems, but also the possibilities that translingual practices offer translation. In an introductory, it's a little bit hard because I'm saying that these translations are failures in the terms that I'm deciding to talk about, right? So bear with me because it's a little bit I don't think we're used to people saying this is bad because it's awkward or this is bad because it doesn't, whatever. But with the translations, I'm actually trying to map out what their intent, what the kind of strategies, the translation strategies, and actually showing some of the issues that come up. So in an introductory note, Asimacopoulos rapidly sketches an interpretation of the book and outlines her translation strategy, including her approach to the proliferation of languages. It is an immediate, simply told, understated account in the plain local speak of an uneducated villager peppered with expressions in English and Italian gleaned from his distant travels, conveniently translated by the narrator of the story for his readers. In my English version, I have done the equivalent. I have peppered the English with Greek and Italian, giving the narrative a sometimes wryly humorous cosmopolitan overlay that contrasts with, but does not detract from the charm of a local Odysseus in the making. Okay, already you can hear that this is a very different sounding story than the one I was describing to you, right? This is her pitch to the publisher in a note, a translator's note. Not only suggests a very optimistic, sort of heroic reading of the novella, but also asserts a complete equivalence between her translation and the source text. If the English and Italian are conveniently translated by the narrator, she has done the equivalent. The fact is, however, that if Kordopattis is seen as a local Odysseus, whose cosmopolitan multilingualism can coexist with his émigré illiteracy, then a significant departure has already been introduced between the source text and the translation. Kordopattis is not an epic hero, it can too easily be argued, but an impoverished migrant whose transatlantic journeys end in failure. Similarly, Greek and Italian in English are different from English and Italian in Greek, not to mention Gringlish and Gritalian. The balance of power between minor and major languages ensures this. Asimacopoulos has, in effect, taken her interpretation of Kordopattis' migration and his translingualism as true to the Greek texts, as a kind of invariance, right, that it contains, and then compared her translation to this interpretation so as to establish an equivalence. So the problem for me is that it's actually sort of imagining that we're going to get back to the source text rather than seeing the translation as a creative interpretive project, something that's going to change it because it's going to be in a receiving culture. The attempt to keep the tale simply told and therefore easy to understand is particularly striking in the translation of the passage where the doctor examines Kordopattis and gives him a scart. Asimacopoulos explains the transaction eliminating the disorienting effects of the translingualism, but also importantly dismissing the larger drama of illiteracy. The history of immigration in the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries shows clearly that the only desirable immigrants were those who read and could read and write. Migrants without access to the Latin alphabet were particularly a suspect. In her translation, the status of Greek as a minor language in relation to a major language like English is elided. The doctor came and started examining us one at a time. Whoever was okay got a card with the words "all right" written in blue pencil in English. Whoever wasn't okay got "unfit" written in red. In the Greek, the Gringlish orite is written, while the skart is simply given. Asimacopoulos' version treats both as written, thus omitting any indication of Chordopatis' illiteracy. Her translation also substitutes unfit for skart and uses all right for orite, eliminating the American Gringlish. In effect, Asimacopoulos turns Chordopatis into a reader, already capable of translating the new language, already on his way to successful assimilation. Given the fact that Chordopatis' inability to read ultimately leads to repatriation, his verbal choices constitute a strong, these choices of hers are a strong interpretation, right? She's making a big decision to do this. Still, the larger question is how her notion of Chordopatis conveniently translating his story for his reader develops over the course of the translation, how it relates to her other aim to pepper the text with foreign words, and how such strategies are linked to source text practices. More often than not, Asimacopoulos' translation depicts a confident Chordopatis who intends to clarify confusion. Free pass in her translation is free pass. Definitions are added in where none appear in the Greek. A frutaria, an Italian fruit shop. A grosseria, an Italian grocery store. The constant clarification is particularly egregious at the end, where the source text has accumulated a Gringlish lexicon, so the word like castrigari can be retained without comment. So basically, the text, like we know from so many writers who write in a kind of new hybrid language, teaches you that new language over the course, so that by the end we know what castrigari means. Whereas Asimacopoulos' translation ignores this opportunity to, and continues adding in these explanatory tags. So she says castrigari, that's what we Greeks call castle garden. Okay, so I realize I'm being trying to kind of, pedantic. I'm saying this is how it's happening, but I want us to try to really think about reading translations, which I don't think that, most of us do, except when our own work is being translated and we go, oh no, how is this being translated? So Leo Marshall's translation, and I didn't look at the time, so you must tell me, but I am going to go on to the next example, okay? Which, and I know these are a bit dense, but when we get to the end, it will be a little bit lighter. Leo Marshall's translation of Dimitrios' May Your Name Be Blessed is more self-conscious about the literary project of bringing it into English, as well as the implications of including or excluding unfamiliar words. Yet Marshall, too, expects his translation to relay the essence of the source text in some unmediated fashion. He, too, winds up confusing his interpretation with the text itself. At the end of his preface, Marshall offers 3 solutions for how to translate the hybrid language of Dimitrios' novel. The first uses some familiar English dialect, the second, some neutral form of standard English, and the third, forms of expression that have no specifically regional characteristics, but which are nonetheless rural in character and in many cases no longer widespread. Okay, this is his language. He rejects the first solution because of its close connection to Anglophone literatures. Okay, so he says any English dialect, Thomas Hardy, it's going to sound like that, and it's going to have all the associations of Thomas Hardy. The second he doesn't want either, because he says its resemblance to the reader's present. His quote, there would be no coherent world distinct and remote from our own, and no distant and lowering horizon on which it is setting. And so he goes for this third solution, because an unlocalized form, he says, makes the language distinctive enough, perhaps even at times, like the Greek, difficult enough to mark it out as belonging to a different and unfamiliar world. Thus, Marshall's strategy transcends the real cultural context of migration represented in the novel. He develops a language that is not simply non-standard, like Dimitrios' translingual Greek, but is otherworldly, not from anywhere in particular. Again, as with Asimacopoulos' upbeat Horatio Alger inflection of successful immigrant assimilation, Marshall's disinterested position erases the troubled politics of the Balkans. And again, in practice, Marshall's strategy does not produce the effects that he describes. In the final passage, Briticisms situate the narrative in the United Kingdom, while transliterated Greek and Albanian situated on the border between Greece and Albania. And neither set of choices secures this kind of otherworldliness, right, that he's talking about. Instead, the reader confronts a farrago of cultural references, both British and Balkan. I climbed onto the bus. I was feeling somehow...
Skip past a few.
Thank you.
I know, that's what we saw.
Why is it going backwards now? No, here we are. Did you guys get this when I was doing that or not?
Yes, we did.
Oh, good.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. So here he goes, and I'm just saying that there's this kind of British and Balkan mix here, right? I climbed onto the bus. I was feeling somehow better. That lad had poured balsam on my soul. Well, what was it made me think of Tsilo? I pictured her seeing me and not coming toward me, but running back to Mama. Look, ma'am, he's here. Spatim is here. I didn't know what to do. I was in two minds. Today, I'd go to the blacksmith's, not to lose the wage. Tomorrow, though, I didn't know. The use of the false cognate balsam for balsamo and the old-fashioned word blacksmith for mastora makes something English and archaic out of something Balkan and contemporary. While the phrase poured balsam on my soul sounds vaguely biblical, and the higher register could work in favor of his project of otherworldliness, it is then undermined by the familiar colloquial lad. Immediately afterwards, we get the Greek mama, followed by the British ma'am, both serving inconsistently as translations of the same Greek word, mana. Any effort to evoke an unlocalized world is further derailed in the next paragraph, where we get the Greek Albanian names Tsilo and Spatim. The translation reads too unpredictably to function as a literary text, whether in its own right or in relation to the source text. Okay, so in the end, the translations by Christopoulos and Marshall don't question the fiction of word-for-word equivalence or the capability of English to give the Greek back to us intact. Their translations don't produce literary effects that can support not only an understanding of translingualism and migration, but for that matter, other interpretations of the text. I'm not saying they have to have this interpretation, right? But they don't do that either. The overt explication that Christopoulos substitutes for Valtinos's transliterated words and code switching results in a kind of pedestrian-sounding language, while the concocted lexicon that Marshall substitutes for Dimitris' intensified yet plausibly Balkan mix of dialects comes off as arbitrary. The translator's unwillingness to see their assimilationist assumptions, whether to a host culture or some made-up world, as interpretations, thwarts their attempts to create translations with their own persuasive creative drive. Okay, so let me end with some of my own experimental translations of passages from these Greek works. My aim is to show how taking on their translingualism might lead to the creation of visually and acoustically arresting translations that take on the political challenge of representing migration. Engaging with the lessons of translingual literature involves learning from textual practices. I mean, this is the idea that it's not just that these things that we've identified in these texts, such as the transliteration or homophony, actually can be things that we can they're things that we can think about as textual practices in translation. There are also things that we might be able to think about in terms of policies and other ways of moving outside of the literary text. The point is not to reproduce Gringlish for Gringlish or Gralbanian for Gralbanian, because any such effort would just be another kind of promotion of a fiction of equivalence. Rather, I want to ask, what happens if we selectively borrow translingual techniques and apply them in specific places for specific reasons? If we recontextualize the foreign accents, code switching and hybrid idioms of the migrant as the stuff of literature, instead of failed attempts at fluency. A transliterative translation of Valtinos's migration tale, therefore, might focus on spelling, punctuation, dialects, to reveal the tension between what looks or sounds similar in two different registers or languages. Instead of phonetically spelling foreign words and then adding definitions, as Christopoulos does with a frutteria, an Italian fruit shop, one could provide the sense of discovery that often accompanies translingualism through unconventional spellings that include familiar English words, such as fruit and grocery in new configurations, right? So you actually spell it like that, frutteria or groceria, so you could see those in there. Such a transliterative translation would enable readers to puzzle out the unknown words. One could also call attention to cultural difference in places where misunderstanding is even more pronounced by using Grecized spelling, alright, rather than all right, or skart with a K, right, rather than skart with a C. Punctuation that likewise puts forward meaning visually could then be used for emphasis. A dash, for example, signals something similar in Greek and English. Such homophonic effects, when combined, can then be harnessed to make larger thematic points. If in the source text oreit is written, but skart simply given, a transliterative translation could bring out the difference between acceptable literacy and unacceptable illiteracy by specifying that oreit is written, and skart, the red dash of rejection, is a mere mark. And you could even add a kind of an M dash there to concretize that sense of it not being writing, okay? Of it not being a literate word. The doctor came and started examining us one by one. Whoever passed got the blue pencil and oreit written out in American on his card. Whoever didn't got a red mark, a skart. A transliterative translation could also signal the relations between different creoles by inscribing foreign accents, bono for buono and yes for yes. This sense of the foreign might be intensified through the repetition of sounds like the Italian O or the Greek S. Not a word I understood. On the way, I see a frutteria, see a light on with a man inside who sees me. Italiano, he says. No, Greco, I say. Buono Greco. Italiano, I ask. Yes, he says. Buono Italiano, I say. Greek sala, someplace to sleep, I add. My eyes swell up. We don't understand each other. The challenge is to introduce the foreign accents so that they work persuasively in the translating language, establishing a different look and sound to destabilize the current standard dialect. If a transliterative translation focuses on visual poetics, the appearance of writing on the page, a homophonic translation could put more emphasis on the oral tradition and how we hear things inter- and intralingually. It might learn from how proper names flaunt their mixed affiliations so as to make them work similarly in the receiving culture. An interlingual reverberation could be set up in the translation with the Greek name Dimitris and the Albanian name Spetim. Phrases such as deem me worthy, treat me fair, that match the meaning of the Greek, could repeat the sounds of Dimitri, while the jarring sound of spetim could be foreshadowed in a phrase such as spit him, kick him, again, where semantic correspondence permits. The goal would be to integrate the sounds of the names into the translingual texture so that the text itself could be already a place where the experience of Dimitris and spetim coexist in a soundscape that makes sense in English. References to songs and other rhyme patterns in the receiving language could reinforce this. I got on the bus feeling good as new. That boy made me swing low, brought Silo to mind. I saw her looking at me, not coming toward me, but running back to Mama. Oh, Mama, he came home. Spetim came home. I didn't know what to do. I was split in two. Should I go to work today to not lose my pay? And then what? No clue. Translingualism invites us to think at the micro level about how to move within and between languages and cultures. If original compositions cross borders and share lexicons, syntactical structures, and reference, then surely translations can do this as well. To preserve and make sense of translation practices, however, we must accept that translations are interpretations that maintain a resemblance to the source text, but simultaneously transform it. An ethical approach to translation that rests on this assumption involves not only making visible the minority status of minor languages and literatures so as to alter our own expectations of what is possible in translation, but also acknowledging what we already share, the unexpected collaborations between languages and cultures that transliteration and homophony make possible. So now Dimitris is going to respond something completely different.
So thank you. It is a pleasure for me to be here. I thank you very much, Karen. It's a pleasure to see you, Mark, after so many years. I envy you for having the possibility of working here. Also, I have to say that. Okay, so I come from a completely different background, but after having read Karen's paper and after having heard what she said, I think that this idea of in between, this idea of hybridism, and that for me it is a crucial concept when we are dealing with power struggle, when we are dealing with identities, when we are dealing with exclusion and inclusion. I think that dealing with all that, as I do in my life, in my professional life, in my academic work, and having heard what you just said about the in-between, I think I understand that even literature and translation have something to offer in this in this conceptualization of these ideas. And for me, that's I gained a lot. I mean, I anticipate a little bit something that I'm going to say at the end of my short comment. You know that a few months ago, Greece and Macedonia have ratified the Prespa Agreement, which finds an end to a very difficult state dispute about the name of the state, the name of the nation, the name of the language. So, in the Prespa Agreement, the Greek state recognizes the existence of a Macedonian language. And in Greek we say Makedoniki Glossa, and in English it's Macedonian language, and in Macedonian language is Makedonski. One of the major arguments of the opposition against the Prespa Agreement is why we have accepted the translation of the term Makedonski, Macedonian language, to Greek. So they would have been happy to find a compromise without translation. Okay? So, which brings us, you understand? I mean, they said Makedonski is good. We accept the existence of a Makedonski language, but which cannot be translated, which does not have the power to be translated after all. And this is where the discussion about power struggle and hegemony comes in the picture. So for me, that is a great example. We did not have the time to share, but I was thinking about it when I was listening to you. So the refusing of translation go as far as I accept it. This is the maximum I can offer to you, but I cannot say it.
But transliteration's all right.
Yes.
Translations.
Yes, exactly. So for me, that is something that came to my mind, and so I think it's a great example of what you're exposing. So the second idea I got listening to you. That is an idea I got listening to you, not having read the text. Is the following. That is something, I deal, as Mark said, I deal a lot with minorities, and I wrote, I worked a lot on minority rights and minority struggle and all this discussion on diversity and, multiculturalism, interculturalism and all this stuff. And what I found out is that over the last 20 years, 30 years already, the big discussion which is going on political theory, political science, comparative politics, public law on minority rights is a little bit based on a kind of an essentialist argument about these rights and about the coexistence of different cultures in our societies, and something which with which I was not very, very comfortable right from the beginning. So what I'm trying to say, the way I try to demystify this essentialist ontology of minority rights and trying to identify this idea of in-between that you have exposed to us is the following: the idea of I write with my left hand. I'm a left-handed lawyer, and as being a lawyer in Greece, sometimes you have the right, sometimes you have the duty also to be the election supervisor. So whenever we have elections, there is a lawyer who takes the key of the polling station and takes all the relevant documents, opens the polling station, supervises the election, closes the polling station, goes to the prefecture, gives the results, and this guarantees, let's say, moral and legal credibility, in the eyes of the state. So I write with my left hand. when I was doing this, I liked it very much because by doing this, I mean, you really get to know the real country. So we used to go to the mountains of Epirus and so on. And there I used to sign or, write papers. And every time I was writing with my left hand, old people, old ladies, old gentlemen of the villages were extremely frustrated, surprised. How can a young lawyer, someone, who represents the prestige of being someone who knows letters, who knows the law, write with his left hand? When I write with my left hand before my students, nobody bothers. They do not even notice that. It goes completely unnoticed. Why? Because, as I said, difference has no essence. There is no such difference writing with your left hand. Difference has a meaning because it is perceived as such in the eyes, in the ears, in the minds of people, and in terms of a power struggle, hegemony, prestige, and so on and so on. So for the old ladies in the villages, writing with the left hand was completely inconceivable, whereas for my students today, it goes completely unnoticed. And I think for me, this shows exactly why we need a little bit to be very cautious with these ideas of, right to be different, all this nice rhetorics of comparative politics, public law, and so on, because I think that they hide, and I think this is the real virtue of what you tried to give us, to give us today. They hide this idea of of this hybridity and all that. And that is a major moral question I have when we discuss about, trying to save languages from disappearing, trying to save languages from changing, from transforming. I'm not that convinced that regarding languages as, species of biology is something which is very wise to do. Politically also, it's not wise. So, okay, it's romantic, it's nice. I understand that, languages have things to save, but politically, when you build on this essentialist argument, it's highly problematic. So for me, what emerges from the perspective you gave us, Karen, I think is exactly this idea of in between, this idea of this transliteration, the linguistic hybridity, which this idea of in between, I think is extremely useful, and trying to connect with literature and try to connect with translation, coming from where I come, I become richer. And I think that it's absolutely relevant, although I cannot hide that when you first asked me and you told me what you intend to say, I was a little bit awkward in terms of how to respond, being me coming from hardcore politics, history, law, and so on. So I can say I'm very happy to try to make this connection with theory of translation, theory of literature, and so on. The second example I would like to share with you before I finish with a final example coming again from the Prespa context, is the following: that reading and knowing Greek and English and so on, so that I was a little bit a privileged part of your audience today because I was watching both texts. I think that I was thinking about the whole discussion about exclusion and inclusion of languages, and all this discussion about migrants and their relation with the hosting society and so on. I have 3 kids, so 19, 17, and 13. For them, it's extremely easy to understand a boy or a girl in their age who comes from Albania from the way he speaks Greek. For me, when I see my students, I'm not able to understand that. So again, for them, this Greek Albanian, as you say, for them it's much more obvious being a part of their generation. When I see my students, I see some people who speak Greek as a native language, and I do not have the means to differentiate them from other Greeks, for example. Whereas the kids, for them, it's something which is a piece of cake. And also this came to my mind when we were discussing all this, when you tried to make this point about transliteration and homophony. Speaking about homophony, what came also to my mind when I was hearing you was a kind of experiment I tried with some of my students after the Prespa agreement has been signed. The Greek opposition was extremely frustrated against signing the Prespa agreement, considered to be, a betrayal, something which, violates national interest of the country, and so on and so on. And I asked some Greek students and some Macedonian students to give me the words used, both in Macedonia and Greece, against the Prespa agreement. And the words were exactly the same. I mean, a perfect homophony. So for me, this relieved me a little bit, because this gave me I understood after that that's a fair deal, because in both sides they say exactly the same things. So that was a good sign. Imagine that, in Macedonia they were saying that's a great deal, and in Greece they were saying that's a very bad deal, or vice versa. There would have been a problem. So I finished about the languages where I started. I said that transliteration might be possible, but translation might be unthinkable, and I used the example of the term Makedonski, which could be accepted within the Greek nationalist narrative, whereas the term Macedonian, no. There is a famous Greek linguist that even went further in this, perspective. He said that, linguistically speaking, this is a language which is the result of an hybridic, this is an hybridic creation of Serbian and Bulgarian, so this is as a Serbo-Bulgarian language, and therefore, since it is a Serbo-Bulgarian language, why we do not call it the Serbo-Bulgarian language? And actually, I met with this guy in a television panel, and I said to him that, okay, maybe you should go to the Catalans also and tell them that their language is a French-Spanish hybrid, and they should stop calling it Catalan because whatever. So. Okay, it's a joke, but it's not a joke at the same time, because it actually shows exactly what are the big dynamics of the hegemony hidden in language, and to what extent the work that you have been, the work you're actually developing and doing can make links with our concerns in hardcore politics about hybridic situations of belonging and not belonging, hybridic situations of exclusion and inclusion. Actually, this is what I'm saying. I mean, there is no example of someone who is absolutely excluded, and there is no example of someone who is absolutely included. Inclusion hides a little bit of exclusion, and vice versa. So all these things, I think people who deal with migration from the social field, I think they clearly understand what I mean. So I finish by saying that again, I feel richer after having heard you, after having read the paper, and I believe that these links between politics and literature and theory of literature and translation are extremely useful for both sides. I think obviously that there is a kind of politics in translation, but we should not go as far as saying that translation is politics, because we need to keep different fields in a semi-autonomy. Otherwise, we risk to excuse our great linguist who considers that Macedonian language is Serbo-Bulgarian. So thank you again.
I think we feel like we should probably, we can sit here, and then in a sense, I'm more interested in hearing your response. I mean, for me, can you hear it? Do we need these microphones or not? We need them. Oh, we do.
Just for the recording.
Oh, okay, right. And do we just hold it like this? Yes. Okay. No, that was very, very helpful, because in some ways I've been sort of puzzling out how to think about some of these questions of transliteration and homophony. And certainly, because it's been going on so much and you're so involved with it, I've been following what's going on with this Macedonian, and that gives us not only the example that I really felt was quite interesting about homophony, but now you're bringing up the transliteration. I mean, for me, homophony came from a journalist, a friend of ours who did a BBC program and went up to the Presbys area and recorded the sort of far-right activist in Macedonia and the far-right in Greece saying exactly the same thing. So that was a kind of moment where I thought, well, this would be an interesting way of actually puzzling out whether this could help us think about this and how. So those are all more rich examples. But I would really like to hear from you questions.
Give me that mic.
Thank you both for this. The Serbo-Bulgarian example is really incredible. I'm glad to add that to my mental catalog of examples. So Karen, thank you. It's a fascinating set of examples that you've put together as well in order to make this case. I'm obviously someone who spends a lot of time thinking about novels and the words that they're made out of and the ways that we make these transitions. And I have two complementary questions for you. I need to explain my background thinking a little bit further. So I was thinking at one point during your talk of A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, which is a really, many of you know it, I expect. It's written in English, but the narrator has been given a dialect that is an invented Russian-English hybrid. And I would say of that book, in your terms, it's a novel of the Cold War, so neither is Russian isn't a minority language. They're both two big languages kind of going head to head. Now, I think it's an extraordinary piece of work, but it's also an exceptional one-off rather than something I would want every novel I read to be doing. And in fact, I think Burgess would say himself that Joyce was his forerunner in this, and I find the style of Ulysses a very, very annoying book to read because the cleverness and the kind of pay attention to the brilliant thing I just did with a word is too strong, like it distracts you from the storytelling and so forth. So that's a preamble to saying that with your examples, I loved your opening section and how you've used these different passages, and translated tactically in order to show us what those two writers are doing. That's a powerful critical interpretation. I completely believe it. And then when I see the passages that you've taken from the translations, it's pretty horrifying. Like, that's really disappointing. Particularly, I think your Traveler to America one, like that just seems tragic that aspect was missed. The other one, maybe it's a little bit more complicated. But when you came to your examples, I'm just not persuaded, and it's back to this reason that's my personal dislike for Joyce, that I could hear as you read the passages, your translations have an affective and emotional power for you. The voice in which you read them was a different voice, and it had the emotion in it. But for me, I come back to this just reservation of wondering whether it's more a poet's choice of language than a novelist's as such. I didn't feel, especially with the Albanian Greek one, I didn't feel that those choices would have aided me as a reader to be reading along and enjoying. The diction was strange in a way that made it kind of call attention to itself that, without having read the whole novel, I can't say, but I don't think that that's a quality of the original language. So I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about the larger set of trade-offs that this particular set of choices needs to feed into.
Thank you. This is a really great question, Jenny, because this is basically, this is the problem of translation culture. I mean, like how we read translations and how we read them differently than we read novels. And the gamble, which is definitely mine is that I want a translation culture that can see a translation doing some of the things that a Joyce or a Henry Roth, with all of his different kinds of languages and accents. And, you're right. It is, to use Amit's word, is again storytelling at some level. It's poetic, right? I mean, basically what I have decided is that these novels, and especially the Dimitriou, which is very hard. I mean, a Greek reading the novel would not really understand what's going on. I mean, because it's not just the Voria, the Northern Ypres dialect, but it's, if you ask him, I mean, there's about 7 or 8 different idiom dialects that are it's very much Henry Roth, I would say, in a kind of mix. And so my response to you is like, I totally get what you're saying, but that actually I want us to be able to read translations for these kinds of translingual, to feel like the text is poetry at times, that certain texts that are poetic, like these two that I happen to have chosen, can do that, yeah? And, I think that you're right. Is it utopian or not? Can we expect a readership to let us read a translation that way, and can we teach? And I think that the real problem with something like a paper like this is that it's not really fair, because these are full translations that we can read, and I'm just giving examples. Usually I talk about translations that I've done. So this is very kind of hypothetical. This is something I'd like to do, right? And only then could we really see if the story is there or not. But I would say that I want a reader who loves novels that are poetic, and that would be the audience or the reader I would like to be able to imagine, not for every translation, but for these translations.
Hi, Karen, this is a really fascinating talk. I'm saving up my questions for tomorrow, but I just want to take off from the last question. In fact, my kind of response was that, I completely sympathize with what you're trying to do as a translator. So the third section after the first 2 translators, which comprises your translations, I sympathize and I'm for what you're trying to do. I was only wondering whether you could take it further. It didn't kind of... I'm not going to use Joyce as a kind of benchmark over here. But you say SCART and then dash a red mark. You say all right in American English. I was wondering what would happen if we didn't have a red mark or in American English, and we wanted the reader to do a little bit more work and confront the immediacy of the language, which is slightly diminished, I think, with a red mark and in American English. I'm wondering if there is an equivalent of that in the Greek, or whether in the Greek original, SCART and all right are being made to do a bit more work in terms of their immediacy and being allowed to have a little bit more impact in the way you want them to.
That's also very helpful, because I think that you'd have to have the whole text, but they are doing, it does say in American, right? And whereas Christopoulos translates it in English, I wanted to give the all right and the accent, right? So I made that. The idea of making it do even more work is really what I would hope to do, because that's the example of Castle Garden and Castrigari, is that one of the things that we know from Cholu's novels, lots of things, these texts that are in one language that are also speaking another or bringing in other languages, is that they teach you that other language. I mean, that's what I'm hearing you're asking, is like, can I even, by that point, can the reader know these words in some form? And that's what I would hope. There's a wonderful French-Greek writer named Vasilis Alexakis, who got kind of tired of writing his novels about Greece in Greek and then translating them into French, and then writing his novels in French about French people in French and then translating them into Greek, and wrote a novel in which he created, it was all in Sango, or it taught the reader an African language, a third language. And it's interesting because by the time you get to the last paragraph, you can read that. You know it. So I think I would like to be able to think that one could do it. In this particular case, I want to think about what it means, transliteration, about that visual impenetrability. So I want to have a homo icon. I want to have a poetics of the eye. I want to have eye dialects. But yeah.
I'm wondering if there might be a way for you to address some of the questions that have come, and which I also have, by emphasizing a particular kind of temporality of translation and translation studies. Because what you're actually marking out is a very early moment where transliteration precedes idiom, for example, transliteration and homophony. Because what I was struck by in some of your examples that were sort of, so for example, the culinary examples that you gave, to me were not instances of transliteration. Those were the adaptation, the culinary ones. So kimchi was one of the ones, right? That's not necessarily transliteration. That's the adaptation of an idiom from another language into another one. And so, but what you're talking about in terms of all right.
So the word is not kimchi in Korean. It is.
It well, I mean, that's the thing. It's specific to, we know what it is. It's not necessary. It is a very specific thing, which is a specific culinary thing, right?
But it doesn't, the first time.
Again, this is the question. This is that you're emphasizing a particular temporal moment in the transformation of a term, right, and its introduction into a language. And I think that we are hearing something, a different temporality, because one of the things I was struck by is, the other thing is that you're talking about transliteration in a temporality of a migrant, as opposed to the way in which we might be, we're hearing it as English speakers, which is, oh yeah, that term means all right. Right? So that gap is something that I think that you really need to mark out, because the transmission of your argument is reaching an audience that is already in a different temporality. So again, that's sort of the gap between translation studies and us, is that, you know, if you were talking about your specific experience and your choices about that translation, it would be different. But so I just kind of feel like there is a temporal gap that non-translators, right, or even in the moment of your articulation of it, juxtaposed against its phonetic rendering on the screen, I think we're still struggling to make that leap.
No, that's very helpful. And I think that's one of the things that I wanted to use by having these different examples of what I'm calling an American in a kind of crude way and a Balkan, is that there's something about the temporality that is so marked. And something like Christopoulos' translation is kind of fascinating, because she's basically inscribing that moment of assimilation of the Greeks in America, which is a much later moment.
Yes.
Yeah? Yeah. And so in some ways what I had hoped, as somebody who wants a translation to be an interpretation, to be a strong interpretation, and then to do it, I was hoping that the Christopoulos translation would just say, listen, I'm going to make him a traveler, I'm going to make him an assimilated Horatio Alger who succeeds, right? Mm-hmm. And to just do it in a very consistent, interesting way, right? But it, you know, and then that would have been complicated, but it would have been an interpretation.
Right. But the difficulty is being on the other side of that.
Right. No, I hear what you're saying.
Because I mean, what I kept hearing is the way in which English is being adapted is sort of horrifically shattering the German language, right? So that you have things like every sentence in German is a reference, is using English words. But I'm hearing that on the other side, right, of the adaptation of a foreign language within the language of German, right, which started with what you're talking about. Right. Right. And I think that's what we're more familiar with.
Right. And I guess what I'm trying to get us back to is that moment that Dimitris was talking, where he says, where it's transliterated and it hasn't yet become something that we understand what it is, right? And I mean, and that's what that novel is, right? Because it's about 1907, right? But yes, there's got to be a way to make that a bit more clear, because I wanted to say the cognitive difference between these two examples is really different temporally, because the Balkan example is that we're always already knowing all these words that are the same, right, in different scripts, different alphabets, right? So, but thank you, yeah.
So the comments to Karen and Dimitri, different one. I love what you said, that by the end of reading the translated book, the readers will learn some original native languages through the translator or through the invisible translator. I think that's amazing. You know, it demands different type of reading, which is kind of, our reading is kind of sleep reading. It's kind of invisible, smooth reading without noticing which language was, in a way, you know, because I think the modern publishing business is to ease out, to delete the difference or the meaning or the culture difference, to make you feel you are just inside this massive dream. Yeah. So that, I think, really I value that. But when Dimitri, when you finished your talk, where you just stopped that bit, I wanted you to go on. You were talking about the relationship between politics and translation. And you said, well, translation shouldn't be politically too much engaged. But on the other hand, I think, you know, as a native Chinese speaker and writer, I find the translation extremely political, especially when we move between the major language to the minor language. And also, especially when we move between, say, a major language like English and a major language like Chinese, is so much kind of commercial censorship, political censorship, but also the choice, political choice being made. It's such a neglected area, no one talked about it. So you just pointed that, but you stopped. I want you both, can you go on a little bit more on this?
Of course, translation is a political, operation. What I just pointed out is that we should undertake the responsibility of a politicized, let's say, the political character of our cognitive action, in the same time knowing and distinguishing that this is not a place to play politics in a brutal way. That is what I would like to point out. I mean, and it's again the in-between thing that I like in that yes, there is politics in translation, but translation is not politics. In the sense that there is a huge material outside translation that should not come inside this operation. That's how I see it. And I'm a little bit, sometimes I'm afraid of, deconstructionist postmodern arguments that will make us believe that everything is everything. And I don't like that. That is what I'm saying.
But I think I understand what you're saying, though, that at some level, no, I think, I think that there's something about the idea that this was a kind of trying to say an experiment, talking about the in-between, where these things that I find as somebody who loves to read literature, and I find in these books something that is teaching me a different way of thinking about the way in which I live in the world. I mean, that's what literature does. And then I tried, okay, so there's a way in which these strategies that seem to be doing something, that are telling me differently about how migrants integrate or don't integrate, and all these different kinds of, we don't just have assimilation, and ghetto separatism, right? These two kind of four different extremes. We have all these in-between strategies. And so trying to do that in translation becomes, for me, a kind of middle ground between also trying to see what the relationship is to something like transliteration or homophony in the political examples that Dimitris gave us, that there is a sense in which translation is politics because it's already trying to move something that was started somewhere into a different sphere. I mean, maybe politics, or maybe just want to say social text, or society, right? So I think that there's a way in which we're trying to move between these places, and that in my particular model, translation is in a kind of not quite the same territory. It's a second order disc. It's not the same thing as literature, I want to say. It's not, it's doing something different, and in a way it's slightly closer to politics, right? It's doing something else, but yes?
Yes, Dimitri, I take your point about it not being politics. I think that stands. But, so I'm a writer, and sometimes, I just give you an example about class. So I wrote a short fiction in which an upper class British gentleman, instead of saying yes, says is.
How did you write that?
E-A-R-S. So there's yes, and there's is. So this was a sort of, so this ran through the page. My editor said, no, that this didn't stand. But he was a very upper middle class gentleman. So I said, well, how so? He said, so you say he's saying yes. I said, well, I've written him saying yes. So he said, well, the reader will just read ears, because it's E-A-R-S, as how I spelt it, instead of Y-E-S. So I said, well, no, the way it's constructed, it's obvious that it's yes. Yes, he agreed. He said it like that. So he was going to completely censor that experiment, that phonetic experiment, on the basis of class. He didn't feel that his class had is. But in the end, we agreed that it would stand, but he wasn't pleased.
I spent a couple of years at Christ Church in Oxford, and I was told very early on that you'd never refer to Christ Church as Christ Church because it's the Ides Christi, meaning the house of Christ, but of course you weren't at the house, you were at the heis. Everybody went around saying the heis. I had no idea what they were talking about at the heis. Everybody's invited to continue over food upstairs, but perhaps you'll first join me in thanking Dimitris as the respondent and Karen van Dyck for a wonderful talk. Thank you both very much.